Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW-LP Brattleboro. I'm your host of the show, Olga Peters, and this is where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Today, I am speaking with Senator Nader Hashim, who represents all of Windham County. And he has served in this last session, the Senate Committee on Education, as well as chairs the Senate Committee on the Judiciary. So thank you, Nader, for being here as part of the, what I'm calling flashback on session 2025.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know you and I have said this before, but one thing I really appreciate about what you bring to the State House is, you have that experience as a state police officer. You now work in law, you now practice law. And I just feel that's two very interesting sides of the same coin that you're bringing to the State House. So I'm looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts on the bills we're going to talk about today. So my first question, Nader, is the question I'm putting to everyone, which is, now that you have a little distance between you and the adjournment, how are you feeling about this session, and how would you characterize it?
I would characterize it, well, first, for context, this was my fifth year in the legislature now. I had one term in the House, one term prior to this in the Senate. And so this is my fifth year in the legislature. I would say that this last session, to be completely candid and succinct, was probably the most unpleasant session that I was a member of the Senate or of the General Assembly. And I say that not because I dislike the job, or anything like that. It's just that we were dealing with a very different composition, obviously on the federal level, and also on the state level as well. We lost the supermajority in both chambers. People have different feelings about whether that's good or bad, but the vibes were different. I'll just say that. And there was a lot of uncertainty about federal funding. We had joint meetings with the education committees about money that, tens of millions of dollars that were supposed to come to our state, some of which now is starting to come, and others which are, we're still waiting for. And so there was just often a lot of uncertainty. And, in the world of judiciary, it was just a constant barrage of changes on the federal level that, caused us to, have to pivot quite a bit, primarily related to immigration related topics, when it comes to judiciary. And so, yeah, that's kind of just the general overview of this last session. And, even though it was unpleasant, it was still good to be there, kind of on the front lines of creating state policy to protect Vermonters while we're dealing with a whole lot of chaos and uncertainty on the state and federal level.
I find, thank you, Nader, for sharing that. And my follow-up question is, a lot of the language you used, things like uncertainty, changes, funding up in the air, is a lot of the same language folks used during the pandemic. And so I'm wondering, what is it about this uncertainty and these federal changes that feel harder, or changes in the State House, however you want to characterize it, that feels either harder or different to the pandemic?
From my perspective, a lot of it comes from just the legality of what's happening. People don't tend to panic until lawyers start panicking. When we're talking about courts and laws and crime and so on. And the number of conversations I've had with attorneys who are kind of questioning on a more existential level, what is the point of my job if the laws
Mm.
don't matter? And as a newer attorney myself, I'm just like, oh boy, is that it's frightening to hear that from somebody who's been a practicing lawyer for 10 or 20 years. And court is where we resolve conflict. And when the rules only apply to some folks, then uh, then it becomes very worrisome. And sorry if you can hear my dogs barking in the background. I guess they have feelings on the issue too.
They're picking up the vibes.
Yeah, they're picking up the vibes. They're picking up the vibes.
Well, the first thing I have to say is I was joking last week with your peers in the State House, Emily, Zon, and Ian,
Hmm.
and we were all joking about what needs to be on the T-shirt. And Emily Karras Duncan had referred to the State House as a graduate degree in
Uh-huh.
Vermont, so
Yeah,
that was going to be on a T-shirt. But now I think no one panics until the lawyers panic.
yeah,
Might
yeah,
have to
no,
be on a T-shirt.
yeah.
Um, so thank you for that perspective. I don't know, for someone who's practicing law, as scary as this is, what are you holding on to right now?
What am I holding on in what regards? What do you
As
mean?
either a state senator or as a lawyer, whichever part of your life you want to pull from,
Oh, okay.
if things are being shook up that badly, how are you still moving forward with the work that needs to get
Yeah.
done?
I think that taking a step back from the panic and trying to ground yourself and recognizing that, throughout history, there's turbulence and then there's smooth sailing and then there's turbulence again. And it's just, it's a constant back and forth throughout our entire history. And I think that recognizing that eventually there'll be smooth sailing again, hopefully, uh, that's kind of, what I hold on to. And, I try not to let myself get bogged down in the panic and the uncertainty because that just, when you're in that state of mind, your decision making isn't as good. And so,
So true.
and on top of that, I think about, I mean, my daughter is 15 years old, for example, and I
Wow.
talked to her about the future, and I talked to her about, just what her plans are, and I remind myself that there's going to be the next generation that will be sitting in these seats, and eventually, things will pan out one way or the other, and that's I don't know if I'm articulating that well, but that's kind of how I, you know, stay grounded and try to think more positively.
I think what I'm hearing, if I were to boil it down to another T-shirt, is "This too shall pass."
Yes, thank you. Much more well said than the stream of consciousness I just shared with you.
Yes, but we're here for the stream of consciousness, so
Oh, okay,
bravo.
good, good.
Now, remind me, Nader, was this your first session on the education committee?
A second session.
Second. So, what was it like working on the big education bill? Because if I remember correctly, it did seem, again, outside looking in, that a lot happened between, with reconciling what was happening with the House's version and what was happening with the Senate's.
Mhm.
Um, so, my first question is, does that feel like a fair sort of baseline
That there was a lot
understanding?
of back and forth between the House and the Senate. Yeah, that's certainly fair baseline. Yeah.
And for you, what was it like going through that process and seeing that bill change and evolve and move in all sorts of directions, it felt like?
Yeah, it was a challenging process, and it was
Mm-hmm.
one uh, that raised a lot of red flags for me on the Senate side. To be honest, I think that there were a lot of things, frankly, leadership could have done differently with how we managed this bill.
Mm.
I think that you know one example I'll provide you. One of my big things was for us to hear from the Commission on the Future of Education. And this was something that, I helped in drafting the policy for last session when I was on the Education Committee, because we could, see the writing on the wall that education was going to be a even bigger topic this session. And so when we were working on, building the Commission of the Future of Education, that was supposed to be the group that was tasked with basically providing the roadmap of how we would address education reform this last session.
Right.
And, I insisted multiple times that we need to hear from this commission. They need to at least come in and introduce the work that they've done and maybe even help us as we go through the process. Uh, Unfortunately, though, the several requests that I made to have them come in and testify were not taken.
Mm.
And I still don't know why that happened. And I don't want to speculate, but that was one red flag for me. And it felt like some of the decisions, the policy decisions that were made, specifically for the pupil weights, were made without evidence to support them, which is a necessary thing to use. Thankfully,
Hmm.
that changed once it went to the conference committee.
Okay.
But watching the committee just throw out numbers about pupil weights, which for listeners, that pupil weights affect essentially how much money a school will get per student or a district will get per student, and having other senators just throw out numbers saying, well, what about 10? And then another one, well, what about 15 or 0.15? And then they say, well, what about 12? We'll meet in the middle. And I'm just like, where's the calculation for this coming from? What analysis is being done? What, we need to bring in evidence and experts who have this information. Maybe the Commission on the Future of Education could help. And so you can tell I have feelings about it, but it's that's kind of what it was like on the Senate side of things.
Well, I appreciate that insight, Nader, because the funny thing about you talking about pupil weights is when, gosh, I think this was in the before times in 2019,
Mhm.
when the UVM study was done to really look at the pupil weights that had been used, especially for like rural schools and kids who their first language was in English, speakers of a second language. It said in the report, we don't know what data, I'm paraphrasing, this is not an exact quote, we don't know where this data has come from that
Mhm.
has been used for the pupil weighting. So it's something Vermont's done before, and you'd think we wouldn't want to do it again,
Yeah.
make this very big formula based on a lack of data. Um, so I appreciate that insight. And I also appreciate what you said about the Commission on the Future of Education, because I still am very excited about the work that that commission can do. And I did feel a little bit like the big education bill was kind of pushing it out of the way,
Mhm.
and not waiting for that work to get done. Um, there's my 2 cents for what it's worth. And what is it about this bill that you think would be very useful for people to understand now? Because it's called the big education bill not for nothing.
Mhm. Yeah, so what the legislature has a tendency to do with the bigger bills that are more controversial and more sweeping, there's a tendency to kind of water it down and kind of stretch it out over time and have multiple steps in place. And there's pros and cons to that. I do think it's a better idea to roll things out slowly when you're talking about a huge reform that will affect the entire state and the future.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so what was compared to what was originally proposed, I can't remember the precise year um, timelines right now. I don't have my notes in front of me, but compared to what was originally proposed by the governor, what eventually passed has a slower rollout of this of the changes, and steps that have to be taken before those changes take place. And the redistricting process, uh, which I believe the first meeting is August 1st,
Mm,
to determine the new maps of the new school districts. And then those districts have to be, or those maps have to be voted on. And so it's the bill that passed is a safer approach compared to what was originally introduced.
hmm. And I've been wondering how to ask this question because I don't just want to ask it as an either or, up, down, yes, no, black, white question. But for you, are there parts of this bill that you're looking at and you're thinking, oh, yeah, okay, that moves us in a good direction? And then
Mhm.
are there parts of this bill that you have concerns about?
Yeah, it's a tough question because it's hard to say, this is definitely bad or this is definitely good, because there's no one size fits all for different districts. What might
Right.
work in one district may not work in another. Um, there are some districts that, could likely operate better if they're merged with other districts. And there are others that want to maintain their independence and maintain their local voting power. Um, and having that, I know that's important to a lot of Vermonters. I think the biggest piece that I would have concern with is the budgeting.
Mm-hmm.
I know that local communities really like, as far as I know, they like to handle their own budgets for their schools and their property taxes. Um, and taking 90% of that away and leaving it up to the state, I think is going to bother a lot of folks who want to maintain that independence and that ability to determine their own budget. So yeah, I I think that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, well, and I am fully aware that we're talking about something that is in bill form only,
Yeah,
and the rubber has not met the road yet.
yeah.
And like you said, we have that rollout. One question I've had, and view my previous comment of rubber not hitting the road yet. One reason we are dealing with some of these education issues and finance issues around education is we just don't have the school population
Mhm.
that we have had in other generations and at other points in time in Vermont's history. And I'm wondering, given the work we are doing around demographics, trying to attract new families here through like the Grow Grant initiative and that type of thing, if we did grow our population, or even if one school grew its population, is there flexibility in this new system that's trying to ratchet down costs and kind of find some savings? But they're all savings based on smaller populations. If our population was to suddenly grow, could that throw a new spanner in the works?
Uh, I I'm not quite sure. I think, I mean, ultimately, I think that having an increased population will be helpful, generally speaking. The more families and students you have, the more of a tax pool that you have to draw from. But how that would work with the new system, you know, I, yeah, I'm not entirely sure if it would necessarily be a negative impact on the system in any way. But there's the world is always full of surprises and
Mm-hmm.
unexpected outcomes. So
The reason I ask that is, one, I'm just always fascinated in how and thank you for not looking at me like, Olga, what the heck? Um, I'm fascinated how systems work, but it also has been floating through my mind because, as folks know, I'm down on the Massachusetts border in my cute little town. And right next door there are two towns, Heath and Rowe.
mhm.
And when I was in high school, Heath had this massive influx of families. And in many cases, they were families with 5, 6, 13 kids.
Wow.
And so the school's population, went from this to huge. And I believe at the time, Roe and Heath shared, next door Roe, shared a school. And the town of Roe said, there are way many kids here, and Heath, you got to deal with them. So Heath built its own school. Well, my cousin and I were talking about this the other day, and a few years later, Heath has closed its school because it doesn't have enough children, and the kids are bussed all over. And Roe now doesn't have enough kids because they're
Uh-huh.
no longer sharing with Heath. And my cousin's comment was, if Roe just hung on through a few tough years, then the balance may have come back into equilibrium.
Hmm.
And I know that's not exactly what Vermont's dealing with demographics, but it does make me think about how nimble can systems be to shift with as populations shift and change, and not every generation is the same size.
Yeah.
You know, um,
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think like we were talking about earlier, the school population is down compared to decades ago. And so, there are towns with these larger buildings that are left either unused entirely or just partially used because of the smaller populations. And, this was a conversation, and I think it was nothing more than that. I don't know if any policy came out of it into any bills, but, there was this conversation about, what can we use uh, these older buildings that aren't being used for students, can they be retrofitted for housing? And then
mhm.
if hypothetically the population booms over 5 or 10 years, can they just be, you know, easily retrofitted again to turn it back into a school if necessary? And when you said the word nimble, it reminded me of that conversation. I can't remember if we put that into the school construction bill, perhaps, or maybe the education bill, but there was talk of it, and I just can't recall if we did anything regarding any sort of policy surrounding that. I mean, maybe it was in legislative intent, which isn't the most impactful thing, but yeah.
Well, thank you, Nader. Are there key aspects of this bill that you'd like to highlight for folks that maybe have not has not gotten the same attention that other parts of the bill have received?
Well, I think that the main piece. I think we touched on one of the pieces that I think is the main piece, which is local budgeting, local voting, and local control. I think from what I've heard, that was one of the big ones. The concern about, does consolidating actually save money, and the question of, are we not peeling back enough layers of the onion and just cutting costs, but not addressing the issue of population enough, and then we'll have to be back here in 5 years doing the same thing over again. That's another concern. I remember when Act 46 was happening. It happened right before I became a state representative. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that seemed really challenging and complicated. I'm glad that's in the rearview mirror. And now here I am on the education committee dealing basically with the second version of Act 46. Uh, and so, my main concern is are we just going to be back here in 5 years doing the same thing again? Um, but that kind of diverges from your the original question you asked. So
That's fine.
I think another point to raise is, we're not really going to know what districts are going to either have higher taxes and more school funds, or vice versa, until the maps get drawn out.
Mm.
So it's going to be some time before that. So yeah, those are just some general points I think that should be raised about the bill.
One thing I have felt, and I've said this before on the show, so listeners bear with me. I feel like we often struggle in this state around control versus state control,
Mhm.
because the greatest efficiency of scale could probably be found at the state level. And yet we are different towns and different communities. And so, at the community level is probably where a lot of the real better decisions could be made, just because
Mhm.
we know our communities, or hopefully we do, fingers crossed. How did this bill reconcile that tension between local control and state control, or did it not? Did it ignore it or make it worse?
I don't think that it really did reconcile it. You know, it, I know there's a supplemental spending piece that was included, which gives districts a little bit of discretion with some funds. I believe it's 10% and then 5%, and then the rest will be handled by the state. That's the closest reconciliation that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you. Couple minutes left. What would you like to leave listeners with as far as the education bill or the session 2025?
Um, Session 2025, yeah, I think, frankly, I think we covered quite a bit on both of those topics. So, not sure of much else that can be added. I will say, there's one thing I could say is, the amount of communication and outpouring that came from constituents and people from all around the state about the education bill was helpful
Mm,
and changed the course of the bill. I think we would have had a version that was more similar to the governor's if we did not have such an outpouring of correspondence from people who were concerned about what was happening to education. So, my what I would leave folks with is, reaching out to your legislators works. It should work, and you may not always get a response. There were weeks where I was getting 500 emails, in a week, and you know, we're it's we don't have any staff. It's just whenever I'm responding to an email, it's either me at the coffee shop at 6:30 in the morning getting my breakfast, or if I can find 5 minutes in the day. So we may not always be able to respond, but many of us see all those emails, we see the letters, and it helps to stay connected and communicating with your legislators and other parts of government.
thank you, Nader. Nader Hashim and I will be back after we hear from some underwriters here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. We'll be talking about some of the bills he worked on in committee that I'm looking forward to hearing how these came to be and how they went forward. So hang tight, folks. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW LP Brattleboro. So glad you can be joining us. And if you just are, I'm Olga Peters, the host and producer of the show, and I'm speaking with Senator Nader Hashim, who represents Windham County and has served on the Senate Committee on Education, and this was his first year chairing the Senate Committee on Judiciaries. Welcome back, Nader.
Thank you.
And before we dive back into the conversation, a few housekeeping tips, or tips and tricks, I guess. Thank you to BCTV for sharing the video version of our show with other media centers around the state. And just a reminder, the views and opinions of the listeners. Oh my gosh, Nader, it is so hot in my house right now. My brain is frying. Okay, let me try this again. Back up. The views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour belong to the host and the guest and no one else. And I'm going to leave it there before I get myself into more trouble. And I hope all listeners right now are in a cool place. I know Nader's in his basement office,
Yep.
so he's staying nice and cool. And I've got a fan kind of on me, so I'm doing the, model with the hair blowing in the wind thing, but it's hot. Anyway, Nader, let's talk about, before we dive into the bills, I am curious, your first year chairing a committee, what was that like, and what were sort of your lessons learned?
Yeah, it was an experience, and I enjoyed it, and I think I tried to approach it as I the committee isn't a place for me to just push through my own agenda. As the chair, you hold a huge amount of power, and from my perspective as a chair, while you can introduce your own bills, and you obviously, as any senator, you can, advocate for your own priorities. You also have the responsibility of facilitating a fair and balanced conversation, really, between senators who have varied opinions. There are two Republicans and three Democrats on the committee. And, Judiciary is the place where we can talk about either the most controversial things like firearm regulations, reproductive rights, uh, drugs, or jail, or we can talk about some of the most uh, some of the less interesting things to non-attorneys like trusts and estates, family court, things like that. And so, there's not a lot of in between, but I think, the experience I had, it was a good year. It's even though, for example, we spoke a lot about immigration, which, you know, things got a little tense, but, nobody was running out of the room, yelling at each other or anything like that. There are other committees where people were yelling.
Oh
But
no.
yeah, so we were able to keep things relatively calm and collected. And one thing I also reminded myself of is that one responsibility, it it's not required that necessarily every single vote on a bill be unanimous, but it is my responsibility to make sure that everybody has their voice heard and has a equal opportunity to share what their thoughts are, or get witnesses in that they want to hear from, or even propose different ideas or amendments to bills that I may not necessarily agree with. And so that's kind of the approach that I took, and knock on wood, it'll work next year as well.
Good luck.
Thank you.
It seems like a really interesting session to be getting your feet under you as a new chair.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about three bills. The first one I'd like to start with is H98,
Mhm.
which if you go to the state website, listeners, vermont.gov, you can look it up. It passed in May. The governor signed it. And so it's also known as Act 31. And it deals with adoptions and standby guardianship, which I went to the summary of the bill and did look it over. And it's interesting because it's one of those bills on the surface, you're like,
Right.
yeah, so what? But
Yep.
when you start looking into it, it actually has a lot of layers to it and a lot of protections. So let's hear more about this,
Yeah.
Nader.
So this, I really liked working on this bill. So there's two main components of it. There's the confirmatory adoptions and the standby guardianships. The
And what are
confirmatory,
okay? Thank you.
so the confirmatory adoptions are, it's a legal concept that's happening in, I think, 8 or 9 other states right now. It's essentially an expedited way of getting a court decree uh, about parentage, but through adoption. And why this is useful. So, a lot of families who, the parents might be in the LGBTQ community, and if they use in vitro fertilization, there might be one parent who doesn't have a DNA connection with the child. And if that family decides to, for whatever reason, move to another state where uh, this type of parentage isn't acknowledged or legal, or they could face more um, legal ramifications as a result. Having an adoption decree is something that has to be acknowledged by all other jurisdictions, and that's because of the 14th Amendment and comity.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, you know, so what one example, there was a divorce that happened in Oklahoma, where there was in vitro fertilization. One of the parents didn't have a genetic connection to the child, and that parent without the connection was stripped of all their parental rights. So they could not, they couldn't contest, um, visitation or anything like that, because now, because of the divorce, that person was just not a parent at all in the eyes
Wow.
of the Oklahoma court. And in other ways, this could impact people is, trying to make decisions about schools, or really just any decision about your child,
Mhm.
that you were there for, through the process, the in vitro fertilization process, and starting a family. And so having that adoption decree would have to be acknowledged by other courts. And so in a nutshell, it creates protections for those families if they're in other jurisdictions, and they have children.
Mhm.
So the next part of this bill were the standby guardianships, which are to protect migrant families. And these standby, well, this is one of the harder parts of being in state government when your federal government is a little unhinged. There are only a finite number of things that we as a state government can do in response to the federal government because of the supremacy clause.
Right.
And so it's very challenging well, not challenging, it's almost heartbreaking when I get requests, totally reasonable requests from constituents about, wanting to do more about the federal government. And there's only a certain number of things that we can legally do. Um, and I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what is every single thing that we can do that will protect people against some of the policies that we're seeing coming from Washington, D.C. But anyways, that was kind of a tangent. So back to the standby guardianships. One thing that we can do is allow migrant families to identify a guardian that their child can go with in the event that the family is subject to an adverse immigration proceeding. Because
Mhm.
without this law, uh, children whose parents were migrants and whose parents were getting deported, those children would have to go into the custody of DCF.
Mhm.
So now, instead, a family can designate a standby guardian to take custody of that child, a family member or a close friend. Uh, and, there is a screening process that they have to go through in the court. It can't just be a random person who doesn't have the child's interests at heart. Um, and so that and the reason it's called a standby guardianship is, in today's day and age, there are, a lot of these families are getting swept up, and communication with them is very hard. Locating where they're being detained is very hard. And, getting contact to a translator or an attorney is also very hard. And so if they are subject to an adverse immigration proceeding, that child can go with the standby with the standby guardian without having to take any additional steps because they were taken before uh, the adverse immigration proceeding.
So,
So
to be clear, it sounds like this standby guardianship needs to be in place
yeah,
before any immigration actions.
yes, yeah,
So that's good to note, folks, if there's anyone listening to this show who might have immigration status that you're concerned about, um, and you have children, you may want to look into this process now rather than later.
yeah.
Um, and how long does this process take?
I was
Back of
just
the
looking
envelope.
that up. Within 14 days.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So as far as state government goes, that's pretty quick.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, especially as far as our courts go, very quick. And yeah, 14 days. And it's a fairly straightforward process. Um, yeah.
And where can
It's
people find more information on it? Do you happen to know?
where can they find more information on it? I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Okay.
I haven't. Yeah, I'm not sure off the top of my head. usually our courts are pretty good at creating standardized forms for people. And so I would first start with the judiciary page, family division, and just looking for the standard forms. And there should be one that just says, standby guardianship. I'm trying to see if I can look it up real quick. Uh,
While you're doing that, yeah, and I will see if I can find it too. And if I do, I will link to it in the show notes.
Yep, I found it.
Well done.
Here. Do you want the link for it?
Yeah,
Uh,
if you would send me the link, that would be great. I'll put it in the show notes. In the meantime, it sounds like it is on the Judiciary page.
yep. I can put the link in the chat right now if
Thank you.
that's helpful.
Real time, folks, getting
Yeah.
information in real time.
Yeah. There we go.
And it's on the vermont.judiciary.org page. So thank you, Nader.
Yeah.
And how about the, I'm going to say it wrong,
Confirmatory adoptions.
confirmatory. Thank you. That's one of those words that doesn't look like it sounds like to me on the page. How long does this process take? Any thoughts, any ideas?
One moment. Just so what I thought you were going to ask was where is this located?
That's
So
good. That's good information too.
there's the link for the form. It's a 2-page form that can be filled out.
Also on the Judiciary,
Yes.
vermont.judiciary.org. Great.
And how long it takes, I believe it's also quite quick. I think there are also circumstances where you don't even need a hearing to go through it.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, I'm pretty sure you don't even need a hearing for the confirmatory adoptions.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to give people incorrect information.
As long as they know where they can find it. So that I think is the big piece of information right now. So
Yeah.
good. There is more information on the Judiciary page.
Yeah.
Wonderful. In the interest of time, I'm going to shift gears to H118, also Act 8, which was approved by the governor or signed by the governor at the end of April. And this is expanding the scope of hate-motivated crimes. And on the one hand, it's very self-explanatory, but I suspect there's some nuance there.
Yeah.
How does it expand the scope?
Sure.
And do you have any, sorry, before you answer, if there's any kind of real world examples you can give, I think that would help people.
Definitely. So the issue has to do with freedom of speech, and we can't punish people for exercising speech.
Right.
But there is conduct that can be punished, like violence or vandalism. And the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that in circumstances where that conduct is tied to hate-motivated bias, that conduct, the punishment for that conduct can be enhanced. So you can't punish people exclusively for, walking up and down the street with a swastika sign, but if well, here's one hypothetical that this bill addresses. So if a person vandalizes an apartment building and they draw a swastika on a family's home, that family is Jewish, the only victim in the legal sense prior to this bill, the only victim was the landlord because their property was damaged. What this bill does is it allows the victim to also be the family, the intended target of this vandalism. And instead of just an unlawful mischief charge, which is vandalism, they would also have the hate crime enhancement, because you can look from all the facts and circumstances in this hypothetical. Let's say in this hypo, the defendant knows that there's a Jewish family living in that apartment. They've put on their social media that they are anti-Semitic, and they said to the police that they wanted to harass his family. Uh, you can draw from that he had that they had the intention of uh, using this hate speech in their conduct, and so you can enhance that offense now that this law has passed.
Hmm.
Previously, it wouldn't have gone that way. So that's what the bill changes. It was a long time issue that I think this was the way to address it.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, I think we should remind folks that the First Amendment covers a lot, but it does not cover conduct.
Mhm.
And so if I think the story that's often used over and over again is, yes, you have the right to stand up in a movie theater and yell something, but if you yell fire and people panic, those are two different things now, and people are hurt in that panic. Those are two different, um, under the law, two different things. And so, yeah, conduct for a long time has not been covered. But like you said, it sounds like this bill kind of closes that loop
Yeah,
of expanding who is covered
yeah.
by the hate crimes, hate motivated crime laws. Anything you want to add to that before we move on?
No, it was a pretty straightforward bill. The idea first came from the Attorney General's office, and I
It
spoke
has.
with him in the summer before the session. Uh, it's and it seemed straightforward, and this was their solution to this issue that's been lingering for a while in the state.
Hmm. Well, thank you for that, and thank you for the conversation because it's certainly been on my mind. Um, the First Amendment, of course, is extremely important to me given my job,
Mhm.
but I am often sit back and I watch the number of people who sort of manipulate it, if you know what I mean.
Mhm.
And with rights also comes responsibility,
Yeah, yeah,
and we don't tend to talk about that side of the First Amendment sometimes.
yeah.
So, S44, also known as Act 28, which the governor signed in May. And sounds like it's also something that the federal government may have pushed us to clarify.
Mhm.
And this is closing a loophole for when local law enforcement can work with the federal government, particularly around immigration. Was that a fair summary, Nada?
Uh, yeah, just one minor clarification is
Mm-hmm.
it's now it's not originally it was just law enforcement, but now it is all agencies.
Oh.
And so what our concern was that the sort of loophole that previously existed was that if the federal government declares a national state of emergency, whether it's warranted or not, they can circumvent state government and go directly to state agencies and town agencies and say, hey, if we give you X amount of money, will you help us? Will you let us use your police officers to go find migrant families in your town? Or will you share your tax database with us directly, or your health care information about people who come to your hospital? Uh, and that in order for so the loophole that's the loophole that we close.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the event that an emergency is declared, the federal government would have to come to us first because towns and other agencies, whether it's law enforcement or a hospital or Department of Human Services, they would have to get approval from the executive branch in consultation with the Attorney General before entering any sort of agreement with the federal government. And so that's what that bill does.
Mm-hmm. So I just want to say this back to you to make sure I heard it correctly. So we've had on the books something similar that said law enforcement needed to get, basically, in very stripped down terms, needed to get the administrative branch or the governor's permission before working with the federal government.
Yeah.
And now the legislature has expanded that any agency, municipal, state, local,
In a
needs
state
to
of
get
emergency.
in a state of emergency.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, needs to get that permission. Now, what if it's not a state of emergency?
So that one is a bit more complicated because, then we're talking about, does the Department of Human Services need to get permission before they apply for a grant?
Oh,
Or
gotcha.
does a town need to get permission from the state government before they apply for disaster relief funds? Uh, Things like that. So that kind of branches out into its own beast. But, given the nature of our current federal government, uh, I wouldn't put it past them in circumstances to invoke a state of emergency, an unwarranted one, in
Mm-hmm.
order to exercise more power.
Mm-hmm.
And in the event that that happens, we want to make sure that our agencies are not being manipulated or exploited for their data or any other information that can be used in those circumstances.
Okay. Thank you. We have just about 5 minutes left. Is there anything else on these three bills you wanted to bring up before I ask my next question?
Um, no, I think those were all pretty straightforward. Thank you.
And yeah, all of them on the surface may look, like you said, straightforward, but they have a lot of layers, and they are expanding protections, which I think most of us would hope is what laws would do. Um, was there anything that stayed on the wall, Nodder, that you're hoping to revisit after the break?
Hmm. Anything that stayed on the wall?
Or even maybe is going nowhere, but you wish it would?
Honestly, we got a lot of bills passed, and towards the end of the session, I was looking at my vice chair and I was like, I don't know that there's anything else on the wall that we can actually do right now. I mean, we do have limited time, but I think, towards the end of the session, you have limited time. But, even then, I think we were both just kind of like, no, I think, yeah, we passed a lot of bills,
Mm-hmm.
and, it's, I know we're going to revisit the immigration issue this upcoming session again. Um, and, we are going to be dealing with a constitutional amendment. And
Oh, which
that
one is that? I'm sorry, I've
that
forgotten.
is Proposition 4, I believe, the Equal Rights Amendment.
Oh, right.
And that one is going to be an important one that's, I think, going to take up a lot of time. I want to make sure
Mm-hmm.
I have the number correct because so, constitutional amendments, they take 4 years to work on. We passed this. Its first pass through was, I think, 2 years ago.
Right.
Uh, yeah, Proposition 4.
And has it gone to a statewide vote yet?
No, so that'll be after this session.
Okay.
So in my first biennium as a senator, when I was the vice chair of Judiciary, I worked on that proposition. I was one of the lead sponsors and presented it on the floor of the Senate. And one of my proudest moments was getting a unanimous yes vote on that proposition. And so now we're in phase 2 of Prop 4, and so it'll go through another vote. Um, and then in the next election, it will go to a statewide vote.
Okay. So, yeah, listeners, just as a reminder, that's the thing about constitutional amendments. It's great that they take so long because they do have such an impact. I mean, they literally are amending our Constitution. However, because they take so long, it's easy to be like, now, which one was that again? Wait, didn't we pass that already? Wait, what? So, thank you for reminding us of that, Nodder.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, what would you like to leave listeners with before you head back to your real life?
I would say, you know, to try to not let cynicism about the world and our federal government drag you down too much. I mean,
Mm,
to be totally candid, I've been guilty of it where, there are days where I'm just like, what are we doing? If, because it feels like everything's on fire.
Yeah.
But there's always going to be a tomorrow, and there's always work to do to make sure that the tomorrow is better than yesterday. So we just have to keep pushing along and make it through to the other side.
Uh, Thank you. Yes, I've been calling that life after the dumpster fire. We
Yeah,
want
yeah,
there to be life after the dumpster fire. So how are we preparing for that?
exactly.
Yeah. Well, Senator Nader Hashim of Windham County, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And as always, listeners, thank you for joining us. And you can find the Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW LP Brattleboro every Friday at 2, BBC and BBC, BCTV, and many of the media centers around the state. And then, of course, wherever you find your podcasts. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend and stay cool.